Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the Battling Pastor podcast. I'm Michael, recording from my studio in the middle of nowhere.
And I'm Rob, recording from my studio in my living room.
I was about to say, for our video viewers, or for our audio listeners, rather, Rob looks like he just stepped out of his deer blind to do this podcast.
Yeah. You can't actually see anything but my head.
Yeah. So, sorry, it took me a minute to get that joke. So, we're back. Welcome back again to another episode of the Battling Pastor podcast, where we're going through this month, in case you're new, Deconstruction. You would have heard first episode about kind of just from me, real quick primer on deconstruction, what's going on in the Christian community, that sort of stuff. You may have even disagreed with that. So that's cool. And then first episode, obviously you would have heard my part one. Last week you would have heard Rob's part one. And then this week you're going to hear kind of the conclusions of that, or sort of the wrapping up of that with my part two. And that's what you're here today for. As always, Rob may be interjecting and jumping in as we have on the last couple episodes. But in case you didn't catch, or in case it's been obviously a couple weeks since you heard my part one, where I ended it was essentially at when my daughter was born. It was a pretty traumatic birth in regards to the fact that the doctor had told us that they didn't know if my wife was going to live, if my daughter was going to live, if there was a lot of stuff happening within about a 4-hour period. And just to recap a bit, back in college, in case you don't want to go listen to that or you missed it, back in college, I had some deconstruction in regards to like a mental part of it. Going through and saying, well, where did this belief come from that I grew up with? How was the canon formed? How was, all of the things, and how we've preserved it and how we have what we have now, like just really having to think through that. And that was the mental part of it, which I think that's the easier part of it for me in regards to kind of reasoning through that a bit. And that happened a couple times, but it was all within kind of those 4 years of college, primarily. And then you get to my daughter being born. I've had a really easy, good life. So when you get to a point where like nothing's really happened that's been too traumatic, I mean, obviously some grandparents had passed away, but they were old. Some world events had happened that were pretty dramatic, but didn't affect me specifically so much. And then this comes up, and this is the first time, even with all of that sort of stuff happening in the background, where I start wrestling with, God, are you good? Like, what are you doing? What's your plan? And I know that sounds kind of silly, and I want to kind of interject that at the beginning of this episode, because in episode one, my part one, rather, I didn't really talk about the fact that, so when I was growing up, there was the Twin Towers that came down, there was the genocide in Rwanda, there's all sorts of stuff going around. And the question might come up like, well, okay, was your faith never shaken at any point before this one time? And I would say, like, I think for a lot of us, or at least for me, like those were really big events where you do question things. But for me, this hit a lot closer. This was somebody that I love, that my plan was to grow old with. And like this was had direct implications on me right now. And for me, that was a time where I was like, wow, okay. I know it sounds silly contrasting it with like huge world events where so many people are suffering and dying. Why not then? But in this moment, that was the time that maybe it all culminated to where it's like, all right, God, like, what are you doing? And I think this is what I talked about people a lot whenever you're going through situations, that I think having the people you have around you, and I would say God has specifically put those people around you, that's where it really, those are determining factors in your life. So for example, the people that were around me in college, my college professors were there, and I was able to ask questions and get really good answers and get informed answers. And I think they were there for a reason. God had placed them in my life for a reason. And in this moment here, there were people around me that I believe God put in my life at that moment that were able to speak into that moment in ways that were very helpful in regards to kind of grounding my mind, centering my mind in a way that um, that really reinforced the goodness of who God is. Because I think when I've told this story to people before, they say, well, yeah, of course you didn't deconstruct, because I mean, I think if you've listened to this podcast, you know, everything came out okay. Like my wife's alive, my daughter's alive, everything was perfect. And all of the things they said that could have happened to her mentally or physically, she's fine. Believe me, she has a mouth on her. She can use her brain. So nothing is affected there, and she's fine. She's perfect. So like that in and of itself, like I know people have been like, yeah, if that would have come out different, you would have maybe thought different, and maybe I would have, I don't know. But I know in that moment there were people that had been through situations similar to that the outcome did not go well. And in that moment of confusion, and in that moment of worry, and in that moment of really questioning God, are you good? Are you even there? There were people that were speaking into my life that had gone through situations where it didn't come out on the good side of it. And they were talking about God's faithfulness, and they were talking about God's goodness, and they were praying over the situation, praying over me, and praying scripture. And again, I know for some people that's going to sound really, really silly, or, you know, not helpful. But I know in that moment, like what my soul was wrestling with about, you know, I had the knowledge of who God was, but it had really never been tested against this huge moment in your life where, you know, literally everything could come crashing down. And that was really helpful. It's not that it was all like, you know, wrapped up in a pretty bow at that moment, and I've never questioned since. That was just one of the bigger moments, because from that point, like my son that was born like a decade later, there was a lot of questions there too. There were a lot of, but because of that one big moment, especially with my daughter's birth, all of those other moments that have happened that I could point to weren't as jarring, because
It
of,
gives you kind of a framework to work through the other things that.
yeah, for sure. And Rob, I'm losing you a little bit here. You're breaking up, so I don't know if you kind of cut off there. But yeah, the framework, yes, for sure. It definitely does give you a framework in regards to work through everything else. Because now I can reference back to, and this is where people would probably say, well, yeah, but if something else had happened, you'd be in a totally different place. Because I do use that moment as a framework of God's goodness, of where He puts people around me to speak into my life. So for me, that, like that moment, so I had the knowledge of, you know, have already kind of breaking that down and building it back together. And then it had to stand up against this huge traumatic moment in my life that did give me a framework to now work through all of the other things in my life. And again, I want to make it clear in this part too, for sure, that it's not like everything's tied up in a nice, pretty bow, but I think the key point of what you did say there was that there is a framework to operate out of, with the knowledge that He is good even when I don't understand what He's doing. And I think that is an incredibly helpful thing to have. And again, I will 1,000 times over 1,000 times say the people around you are going to affect your worldview more than you think they are. And when you have people that can pray over you, that can speak, you know, from their experience and testify of the goodness of God and how God operates in situations, that all, like, and I want to make sure that I make this clear, like the people that were there, again, had not had perfect lives at all. They had lives that, like, that was the reason I thought my wife and daughter might die. I was like it didn't go out for you really well. Like you're praying this over me and telling me these things, and your life, like, it went really south for you. And so those were going through my head too. And I'm just like how can that person be testifying to the goodness of God in my situation when in their situation it didn't turn out so well? And again, I don't want to say that it was all contained in that moment, because it wasn't, because of that moment, there was a lot of good conversations that came after that with those people that are like, how can you say that God is good? And, you know, you lost your kid, or you lost your husband, or you lost this huge thing in your life. And having those people, talk through those situations and just continually point you back to Jesus, when in that moment yourself, you're really doubting the goodness of God. And in part one, I said it was silly. Like some people might say it was silly because of the way it comes out, that I was even doubting, or I was, just in that moment that it was doubtful. But out of all the moments, like, again, I know there's been way bigger world events that have happened than my daughter's birth, but in that moment, that was the moment that God used it to say, okay, I know, like you have all this knowledge. Now we're going to break down how that applies. So that, like I said, it's not that it's a tied up pretty bow, or that there haven't been like little other moments of having to work through that. But I think in a lot of people's lives, and what we're going to see even, in your part too, is that there's usually in almost everyone's life these, handful of major events that then dictate how you process and see everything else. And how, the people around you at that moment, the way that you interact with those situations sends you down different paths. And I think that's why, like, I want to be one of those people, like they were with me, in that really that moment of incredible questioning, to be able to step in and be that person around somebody else. Because there's people that I know that have gone through deconstruction. I mean, people that we both know that have gone through it, that we grew up with, that haven't come out on a side of believing and trusting in Jesus. And when I look at that, some of the reasons for that is just that the people that they either pushed out of their life, or the people that, consequently they did surround themselves with, dictated a lot of that. And that doesn't mean their story's finished, right? It just means that at that moment, that's the voices that they chose to listen to. And I think that plays a huge part in it, of that the questions are genuine and the questions are real. And sometimes in those moments, and I think we'll see that in your part too as well, is that in those moments, it's not so much, or at least I don't want to say anything about your part too, but for me, I didn't need somebody preaching back the knowledge that I already knew. I needed somebody there living out that knowledge in a way that it was visible to me, and not demanding that I accepted all the answers, but just them being there was very helpful to me. So, and that continues to be true, right? Even in moments now that I'm much more firm in my faith than I was, 15 years ago. But even now, when I do start to question, more nuanced things, it's very helpful to have people there that have been like, no, I've been through that before. And this is, where God is in all of this. So anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I know my internet connection is pretty crappy right here. But I think it's amazing that you and I have very different things that have brought us to where we are, right? But the storyline is for everybody, right? Like the storyline is the same. There are always things that come up in life that happen, whatever it may be, and then it either leads you down one path or the other, right? I mean, it's interesting that even though the circumstances are different, right? Like it's the same play-by-play story, just at times with different endings. And I think you hit something on the head when you talked about the people that you were surrounded with or surrounded by, and the people who were speaking into your life, and that can include or who you're reading or whatever.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so good.
Cool. All right, guys. Well, we're going to end it there. I know I was looking at the times on part 1 and part 2. I know they're pretty short, and then there's so much more that I could have got into there, but I want to give you the brief overview of it. Right? If you guys are interested in hearing more of my story, or after you listen to Rob's episodes, if you're listening, interested to hearing more of Rob's. I'm sure you guys can reach out via DM and be more than happy to kind of have that conversation. But I want to keep these short enough to where you get the idea of it, but also showing, kind of the process a little bit in that. So guys, we will talk to you next week where we end kind of this whole deconstruction, kind of going through our stories. We'll end next week with Rob's part 2. So hopefully you can tune into that. We'll talk to you later.